When the 19th-century nonconformist Hetty Green stormed Wall Street, she didn't ask for a seat at the table, she took it. That America's first female tycoon also eschewed any future claim as a feminist hero, or any laudable legacy at all, only adds to her enigma. The woman we are going to talk about today has gone down in history and even in the Guinness Book of Records as the world's greatest skinflint or miser. And by the way, no one has managed to beat her achievement so far. I think you'll be interested to know what the greed of the once richest woman in the world led to. Just believe it. The story will be interesting, as we have never personally met such a number of facts of absurdity and at the same time talent. Henrietta Howland Robinson, Hetty Green, was born in 1834 into a family with a good fortune for the time. Robinson's main source of income was whaling, and making huge profits through trade with China. The girl's upbringing was entirely the responsibility of her grandfather, Gideon Howland. Hetty Green belonged to the Protestant Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, which was quite common in the New England states at the time. Among the life precepts of the Quakers were always self-restraint, unpretentiousness in food and clothing. This, of course, had a profound effect on the rest of Hetty Green's life. When her grandfather, Gideon Howland's eyesight became poor, Hetty Green sat on his lap when she was 6 years old and read from the newspapers with genuine interest financial news, stock quotes, and knew the difference between stocks and bonds. Eventually, at the age of 13, she became the family accountant and introduced accounting for the family's huge business. Henrietta's life was filled with unchildlike hobbies. She grew up with the news of the stock market. From the age of 13 she was no longer interested in anything but numbers, stocks, bonds, and the stock exchange. And it's worth noting that the girl was just great at what she did. Math smarts and entrepreneurial spirit will make themselves felt soon enough. At age 16, Henrietta was sent by her parents to a school for noble maidens in Boston. She constantly provoked scandals with her peers and did not understand the purpose of studying at this school. As she later recalled, "I just wasn't interested in them. I didn't know what to talk to them about." In addition, it often happened that the girl knew much more than the teacher, and this also led to conflicts. Henrietta learned to count in her head phenomenally before school. Better than any computer that would appear after her death 100 years later. She was not interested in other subjects besides maths and finance at all. Henrietta barely made it to the graduation ball. She came to the conclusion that her school had taught her the wrong things, and enrolled in a one-year accounting course. It was then that she began to take an active part in her father and grandfather's business. The amazing thing was that despite the large Robinson family, no woman was allowed in the business. Because in those days it was considered that men were in charge of the business and women were assigned the role of housewives. From the age of 15 Henrietta took an active part in the all-male family council. Even then she was earning as much as the adult members of the family, keeping accounts, catching and selling fish, organizing her father's whaling expeditions, and even managing the construction of the docks. Can you imagine that? A girl of 15 doing these things as an adult. At the same time, she could give a head start to any interlocutor. There were times when workers at the family's enterprises did not take her seriously. But after 10 minutes of dialogue, they understood that it was better to quickly do what Hetty required without any bickering. That's how she earned her first credibility. Upon her father's death in 1865, when she was 34 years old, Henrietta inherited an impressive fortune of $7.5 million in cash, that's about $111 million today, and was considered the wealthiest Bedford bride in Boston. This raises questions for the Robinson family, but Hetty makes it firmly clear that she will not contest her father's will. With her inheritance she buys government war bonds, the U.S. Civil War is just ending and the new government is in dire need of money. Her father left the whaling business to his brothers, but Hetty wasn't interested in it at all. She had other plans. Hetty saw no prospects for the family business, as the demand for whale oil, which was used for heating and lighting, as well as for industry, was affected by the appearance of a new product on the market, paraffin. In 1851–54 industrial production of paraffin began in America, so whale oil lost its appeal and the business declined rather quickly. On the one hand, technological progress saved the whale population, which was being destroyed in huge numbers, but on the other hand, it also meant the collapse of their family business. This is why in 1860, 5 years before his death, Hetty's father decided to move to New York and invest in stocks and precious metals, as he was looking for new opportunities because the whaling business was losing its appeal. And for Hetty, the wondrous world of the stock exchange she has long dreamed of opens up. She becomes the first woman to appear with her father at the New York Stock Exchange. Later, the stock market became her calling. She was able to predict changes in the share price, knew where to invest money to get income. And other participants of the stock exchange repeated her actions to make money. Since all transactions were always profitable, after several years of successful trading, Hetty Green was nicknamed the Witch of Wall Street because of her incredible ability to predict the rise and fall of securities and property prices. But all this success and wealth had a downside. Hetty Green was very greedy. She liked to make money, as they say, but she didn't like to spend it at all. Hetty made her first investments as a child when she opened a bank account and deposited every cent she saved on shopping. She had been a good-looking young woman. By 20, attempts were made to present her to society both in Boston and New York. Her father gave her a wardrobe worth $1,200, in the tens of thousands in today's currency, but she sold the clothes and invested the money in the stock market. She relied on an unwitting cousin she was staying with in New York to buy her what she needed. In 1867, her Aunts Sylvia and Howland died. Hetty Green was 33 years old at the time and expected to receive her aunt's inheritance, being the only niece. But she was in for a disappointment. On the day of the reading of the will, out of her aunt's $2 million estate, she was bequeathed only $65,000 per year. The rest was bequeathed to charity and to people she didn't know. But Hetty Green was not going to put up with it. She entered into a legal battle during which she contested her aunt's will by presenting an earlier will of the deceased in which everything went to Hetty Green and which included a clause invalidating all subsequent wills. Despite much publicity, the case was lost as the court ruled that the will submitted by Hetty Green was a forgery. To avoid prosecution, she had to marry Edward Henry Green, a multimillionaire from Vermont, and go to live in London. He was 14 years older than Hetty. Edward Henry Green's husband's family included congressmen and judges, and Edward's own uncle was the mayor of Boston. The Greens, who'd signed a prenuptial agreement at Hetty's insistence, keeping their fortunes strictly separate, lived very fashionably in London, spending, of course, only his money. Also remember, it was the 19th century, and women were supposed to be sultry young ladies, not trading on the stock exchange. Ladies did not even have the right to vote back then. To obtain the necessary social status and a kind of screen for their activities, it was also necessary to marry. Their children, Edward Howland Robinson, Ned Green and Hetty Sylvia and Howland Green, were born in London. Ned was born on August 23, 1868 and Sylvia was born on January 7, 1871. While her husband Edward was investing, Hetty Green began to grow her fortune. She came up with an investment strategy that she has been faithful to all her life, investing, a cash reserve for term deals, and a sound mind. While in London, Hetty channeled much of her investment efforts into dollars, banknotes that were printed by the U.S. government in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Green correctly recognized the potential of an American economy recovering from the Civil War, believed in the new dollar and began speculating on the pound-to-dollar exchange rate. It is generally believed that this is where she made her first big money. In the first year alone, her income from speculation totaled $1.25 million, approximately more than $110 million these days. She invested the money she made in railway bonds, which was a promising direction. The rising U.S. economy demanded an injection of funds into transport. Later on, railway bonds were one of her favorite instruments. In them she also invested $650,000, which she had accumulated over 10 years and, as a result of a long litigation over her aunt's inheritance, was able to receive in 1871. Hetty Green's biggest mistake also involved the securities of railway companies and direct investment in that business. By 1892, she owned more than 100 miles of railways in Texas worth at least $10 million. However, these sections were in the sphere of interests of railway magnate Huntington, who, unlike Hetty, also had administrative resources. As a result, all the disputed sites were given to Huntington, and Hetty was never involved in railways again. In 1875, however, thinking the statute of limitations had run out on her potential will-forging charges, the family returned to Bellows Falls, Vermont, Edward's hometown. An eccentric person, Hetty Green quarreled not only with her husband and his relatives, but also with the servants and local shopkeepers. It was back in Vermont that Hetty soon began to show signs of self-neglect. The dirty hands and fingernails, clothes rarely cleaned and worn long after they'd begun to fall apart. And her penury, her children went to school in cast-offs. In wintertime, she lined her sons' jackets and shoes with paper. Her annual income was already in the mid-six figures, in the millions in today's currency, yet she fought with everyone over money and how much she had to pay. Local shopkeepers dreaded her dirty hands on a piece of merchandise. From time to time, the couple traveled to New York on business, each pursuing his or her own investment activities. The couple conducted their business in parallel, without crossing paths on the stock exchange or consulting each other, as Getty had done since signing the prenuptial agreement. Amid the financial crisis of 1885, the financial house of John J. Isco and Son, in which Hetty Green was the largest investor, went completely bankrupt. And then it suddenly emerged that her husband Edward was not only the firm's largest debtor, but that the firm's management had secretly used Hetty Green's investments to lend to him, without his wife's knowledge. It was a blow to Hetty Green that unsecured loans were being made to companies co-owned by her husband. The Green couple's married life ended, and Hetty and her children moved to New York City. She invested all her money in Chemical Bank, now Morgan Chase Bank, and began to engage in usury. Despite this, they maintained a good relationship in later years, and Hetty Green helped to care for Edward Green until his death on March 19, 1902. Edward Green died of heart disease and chronic nephritis. Chemical Bank provided her with a workplace, and every day she went there to borrow money against real estate, thus saving money on her office rent. Hetty Green's priority was still the debt market, although she was also interested in equities. Before buying a stock, she studied the company's financial statements thoroughly and independently assessed its potential. When Hetty Green bought shares, she did so not for speculation, but for investment. In the debt market, Hetty favored land and buildings in fast-growing American metropolises. And it took only liquid real estate as collateral. The result of transactions became the property of entire neighborhoods in Chicago, New York, and other major U.S. cities, as well as thousands of plots of land. She owned mortgages on churches, factories and office buildings, as well as gold, copper and iron mines. Her main businesses were buying mortgages. She especially liked holding mortgages on churches and didn't mind foreclosing when they couldn't keep up their payments, and lending money to bankers and brokerage houses. When she lent money to churches or to a city, in 1900, she financed Tucson, Arizona's first municipal water and sewage system. Hetty often did so at below-market rates. Yet when the transaction involved other capitalists, she was ruthless. But Hetty Green wasn't always as avaricious as it was thought to be. During the banking panic of 1907, securities plummeted in value, liquidity plummeted, and the country urgently needed cash. She lent huge sums to people in dire straits, to companies in New York and beyond. When New York ran so low on funds that it froze municipal construction projects and the hiring of new police officers, Hetty's loan of $1.1 million helped keep the government running. She had made similar loans to the city in 1898 and 1901. During the Panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan organized a famous gathering of banking leaders in the private library of his home on East 36th Street. The meeting, which led to the establishment of the Federal Reserve several years later, was uniformly male, except for a lone woman who wore a black veil as she entered and exited the building. Her son Edward said she regularly sent funds to charity, between $500,000 and $10,000, and about 30 families received regular income from her. While living in modest boarding houses, Hetty often nursed ill neighbors through the night and was known for handing out piggy banks to children, with money inside, and admonitions to save. In keeping with her Quaker beliefs, her philanthropy was not conducted publicly. Hetty Green was also buying up mortgages across the country. The witch's fortune, amid the general panic of 1907, increased exponentially. She conducted all settlements and transactions personally, as well as wresting debts from unscrupulous borrowers. One of the components of success, in addition to accurate calculations of investment efficiency, is the availability of free capital. Hetty Green never had a team, much less advisors. She did everything on her own, and no one can say, how did she do it and how did she manage to do it all? The press followed her everywhere. The attention amused her, she liked it. She said,
"My life is written for me down in Wall Street by people who, I assume, do not care to know one iota of the real Hetty Green. I am in earnest, therefore they picture me as heartless. I go my own way. I take no partner, risk nobody else's fortune, therefore I am Madame Ishmael, set against every man."
She kept most of her assets in Chemical Bank's fireproof vault. Above the vault, in a corner of the common room, she had a separate desk for which she, as a privileged depositor, did not pay. Here, sitting on her own money, she received visitors. The old interest earner used to stuff receipts and money received as repayment of debts into numerous pockets sewn to the back of her long skirt. She kept no documentation, relying on her excellent memory and her phenomenal ability to count verbally. To remind the debtor that the deadline had passed, she was prepared to walk to the farthest borough of New York, and it happened. Everyone knew her, even the most desperate criminals would take off their hats in greeting when they saw her across the street. As for her lifestyle, it was even more complicated. She was ridiculed for personal oddities in her own time. Hetty was nonetheless also respected for her financial knowledge and power. Her children, Ned and Sylvia, suffered all their lives from their mother's thriftiness. Her rooms in Hoboken 1900 to 1910 protected her from New York collectors and vice versa, under the assumed name of Mrs. Dewey, under the assumed name, Mrs. Dewey, after her shaggy dog, Dewey. It left collectors guessing where to find her and the proper state in which to tax her. In the rare skill of making the U.S. government think about itself, Hetty Green excelled. It was thanks to her that the country's tax laws were reworked. Once each state had its own tax rules, which was used by the practical Hetty Green, who very much disliked sharing her income with the state. A surprise for Hetty Green was the passage of a flat income tax on income in 1913. The 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was adopted, establishing a uniform and strict principle of income tax collection throughout the country. Her rooms in Hoboken, 1900 to 1901, protected her from the New York collectors and vice versa. For the next several years, mother and children lived in various cheap cold water flats. Hot water was an unnecessary luxury for people who didn't wash anyway, and furnished rooms where their rents were never more than $22 a month. Her dress was considered shabby, and after her husband's death in 1902, she regularly dressed in black mourning clothes. Her clothes were worn to tatters, and she changed her underwear only when the previous one turned into rags. The girl's avarice began to manifest itself in her younger years. She would, for example, turn out the lights before the last guest had left, put napkins with traces of recent use on the table, and take the candles on her birthday cake back to the shop and demand a refund. I ate at the cheapest restaurants, preferring mostly 15-cent pies. One story claims that Getty spent half the night searching the carriage for a lost stamp that was worth 2 cents. The heating of oatmeal for lunch on the radiators at Wall Street banks, and instructing cleaners to wash only the bottoms of her skirts, since those were the only parts dirted by the muddy streets. The nasty feud with Hoboken over a $2 dog license. She never used the services of maids or laundresses. She sometimes sought medical treatment at charity clinics, and there was an infamous story that she once denied her son medical treatment after a sledding accident, a decision that eventually led to the amputation of his leg. In fact, Hetty Green and Edward went to the best doctors they could find, but they all insisted on amputation. In the end, Hetty Green took it upon herself to care for her son. And she managed to save her son's leg, although he remained lame. A short time later, however, he was hit by a car and again suffered a severe injury to the same leg. This time, the leg could not be saved. Here's what her son himself had to say about the story, a New York Times interview published 6 days after her death. He stated that
the accident, which occurred when he was 7 years old, was not considered serious, which is why no medical help was sought, and it was only in adulthood, many years later, that amputation was necessary.
He went on to say,
much has been printed about my mother that is untrue. She has been represented as being parsimonious, but such is not the case.
Hetty famously made her rounds of New York banks using public transportation, and once stepped off a public coach lugging a parcel containing $200,000 in negotiable bonds. When the Wall Street banker awaiting her arrival suggested she take more secure, private transportation next time, Hetty snapped.
Perhaps you can afford to ride in a carriage. I cannot.
After her death, her sister told the story of how one day she brought her 2 children, aged 8 and 10, for Hetty Green to look after. How amazed she was when she returned 2 months later to find her children thin and hungry. Hetty Green had not only fed them poorly, but had also put them to work in a laundry to keep them busy, working 14 hours a day in the laundry. To save a cent is to earn it, was her motto. Hetty Green attributed her lifestyle to her Quaker upbringing. She said,
my early training disciplined me towards pomp and show. My family has been wealthy for 5 generations. We need make no display to ensure recognition of our position.
A New York World editorial called that remark insolent. Hetty Green also explained to the press,
I do my own shopping because I get 100 cents worth for every dollar. If more people did that, there would be less talk of hard times and the high cost of living.
She never left fear of an assassination attempt and came to many people with her food and a gas burner for boiling eggs. Once she got her gun license, she never parted with it again. She rejected the automobiles that were appearing at the time.
Jesus had a donkey to get around.
Black death cloak, hat with a widow's veil, evil old woman's face, sharp, not at all senile gait, such was the Witch of Wall Street. She was feared by everyone from mayor to civil servant. She was assertive, rude. Trust no one, her father used to tell her. She was hated because she knew no mercy and could ruin anyone who was going to cross her path. She hated some people too, doctors, pharmacists, and the IRS.
Doctors and pharmacists exist to profit from other people's grief. Fatal diseases are not cured, and the others go away by themselves.
In her old age, Hetty Green developed a hernia, but refused to have an operation, preferring to use a stick to press down the swelling. When her grown children left home, Hetty Green moved repeatedly among small apartments in Brooklyn Heights and after 1898, in Hoboken, New Jersey, mainly to avoid New York's property tax, though she did loan money to the city at reasonable rates. Hetty Green amassed her vast fortune through disciplined and conservative methods. As she told the New York Times in 1905,
"I buy when things are low and nobody wants them. I keep them until they go up and people are anxious to buy."
She refused to buy stocks on margin and generally preferred investing in real estate. However, she did not follow a buy and hold philosophy.
"I never buy anything just to hold it. There is a price on everything I have. When that price is offered, I sell."
This has caused her to be called the grandmother of value investing. Her son explained her investing philosophy thusly.
My mother never made any money in speculation. The Greens don't speculate. She has been what you might call a one-man bank. When currency has been scarce in New York, she has always had plenty to lend on good collateral. There is no better judge of commercial paper in the United States.
Mrs. Hetty Green was unique in that she was on a par with Morgan and Rockefeller in the scale of her business, but did so in an era when women were not allowed in business at all. The richest and greediest woman in the world has died at the age of 80, and it happened from a stroke in an argument with a maid in 1916 about overpaying for milk and the benefits of skimmed milk. It seems likely that Hetty Green's reputation as the Witch of Wall Street was more a product of the raging misogyny of her era rather than being rooted in fact. Though undeniably eccentric, due at least in part to her strict Quaker values, she was a disciplined and canny investor who was well taught by her father and grandfather and had at least the grudging admiration and respect of her peers. An early practitioner of value investing, she amassed her more than $100 million, at the current exchange rate it was $4 billion, estate through diligence, hard work, and talent. She earned her position as the richest woman in the world. Of Hetty's two children, it was Ned who made attempts at buying his way to happiness. After his mother's death, he built palatial homes in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts, and in Florida, while indulging passions for aviation, broadcasting, auto racing, and collecting rare gems and stamps. After his mother's death, Ned Green lived in royal style. His summer place in Massachusetts had a staff of 107 on the payroll, not including his valet, a half-dozen private secretaries, a masseuse and a personal maid for his wife Mabel. Sylvia lived quietly in New York and in Greenwich but never had children, nor did her brother. It's been speculated that Hetty's fear of interlopers entering the family was the reason both Ned and Sylvia married late in life. When Ned died, he passed the bulk of his estate to Sylvia, and when she died, her estate scattered Hetty's meticulously built fortune to dozens of distant relatives, universities, private schools, and charities, none of the gifts having been earmarked for reputation management of the iconoclast who built it. Due to her wealth and interests, her name was linked with the likes of Russell Sage, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and other financiers and tycoons of the day. And among 40 names of financiers and tycoons of America of that time, only one, female, our heroine. That's how she is the richest woman in the world. What are your thoughts on Hetty Green's life story? Be sure to write down your thoughts.
Subscribe to Boom Story and don't forget to like it. If you want more incredible stories like this one. By doing this you are not only thanking the author, but also reminding the YouTube algorithm that you like videos with similar themes and that you can train the artificial intelligence to recommend you other authors who compose videos on similar topics.